This is Steve Zeltzer, and the issue of the rise of fascist movement in the United States and internationally, and it's an important issue for the working class in the United States and working people all over the world, and the issue of what's going to happen for the future of the United States as well. And joining us today is David Van Deusen. He's president of the Vermont AFL-CIO, and his state labor council raised the issue of the danger of a rise of fascist movement in the United States and passed a resolution prior to the January 6th coup that the labor movement had to mobilize, had to prepare for a dictatorship in the United States, or attempted coup and insurrection. So welcome to WorkWeek, David.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
So David, first of all, are you concerned about the rise of fascism, and what does fascism mean to you, and what do you think it should mean to the labor movement in the United States?
Absolutely. Anybody that's paying any attention at all must be acutely aware that the fascism represents a serious threat to our very way of life here in the United States and is on the rise. What we saw happen with the authoritarian attempts by the Trump and his allies to stay in power after losing an election is a good example of that. And what they would like to do is limit our ability for regular people, working people, to have a say in society, to consolidate power, and to use tools such as racism, discrimination, and various notions that divide us as the way to build wedges between working people, to keep us divided, to keep the few in power as opposed to the many. So we have to be massively concerned about this. And just because Trump is, for now, out of power, does not mean that the danger has particularly diminished.
Well, it seems Liz Schuler, on the anniversary of January 6th, said that we have to protect our democratic rights, and that means that we should look to the Congress and the Democrats to do that. You don't agree?
I had a very good one-on-one conversation at some length with President Schuler not very long ago, where she very bluntly expressed her continuing concerns about democracy in our country and it being eroded. With that being said, I would say to anybody that would listen, we cannot rely on the Democratic Party at all. The Democratic Party is inept when it comes to realizing what the real danger is here. They overestimate their own strength. They overestimate their own ability to play defense. And we see that even with them in charge of both Congress and the White House, our voting rights have been eroded in dozens of states across this country, massively eroded. So if we put our eggs in the basket of the Democratic Party, that's a recipe for failure. Organized labor must rely on itself. Here in Vermont, we've done three things that we should be doing nationally as a labor movement to defend our communities against fascism. Number one, when the time came and when democracy was under threat of a potential coup, we went to our members, and our members, by overwhelming numbers, authorized us to call for a general strike should there not be a democratic transfer of power on January 20th, as our Constitution demanded. And that was number one. Number two, we have chartered an anti-fascist motorcycle club here in Vermont to act as an appendage to our sergeant at arms to help provide security to our unions and to the labor movement as needed going forward. That's something that's important that we do across this country as well. And number three, we went to our members and they overwhelmingly passed at our last convention a position whereby we now oppose gun control. And let me explain to you what I mean by this, Steve. The far right, groups like the Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, neo-fascist group, Aryan groups, white supremacists are overwhelmingly armed. And as we saw, people like Trump are willing to tell them to stand by and take action, as we saw on January 6th, when they see it in their right-wing self-interest. We cannot cede the territory of the ability to defend our communities and our unions and working peoples to the state alone. We have to be willing to step up and defend ourselves if that time comes. So those three concrete steps show how serious the Vermont AFL-CIO, our 11,000 members, take the threat of fascism in this country. And we will do what has to be done to defend democracy here in Vermont and beyond.
Well, one of the issues, and we've discussed this before, is although the your state council and some labor federations or labor councils took action, there doesn't seem to be a debate within the labor movement about the rise of these fascist movements. How do you see that happening? Because The upcoming convention of the AFL-CIO is going to be June in Philadelphia. Do you feel that there needs to be a discussion, debate in the labor movement as a whole about how to deal with this growing crisis?
Of course there does. And we see that happening in pockets right now. And the Vermont AFL-CIO will do everything in its ability to make sure that that question remains on the table and seriously debated between now and when the next crisis arises. But again, what the debate needs to be centered on is not how we could support electorally those candidates that are somewhat or to a degree anti-fascist. The debate needs to be, how can we rely on ourselves? How can the labor movement, how can the unions ourselves develop the power, the strength, the organizing ability, and the support in the factories, in the job sites, in the communities, which will allow us to resist fascism should it rise its ugly head in a more pervasive way in the United States. And we have the ability to do these things. We have the ability to organize this way. We've seen it, working people do it the world over, from Spain in 1936 to Northern Syria and Rojava today. But we can't be afraid to rely on ourselves. In fact, that's how we're going to grow power. We're not going to grow power by sending lobbyists to Washington. We're going to grow power by internally organizing and externally organizing to grow our ranks and make those we already have within our ranks stronger and more ready to be mobilized and to take action.
Well, one issue that the Democrats and the Republicans are united on is expanding the military budget. Expanding the bases, U.S. military bases. They're building a base in Okinawa, another base, and sending troops abroad. It seems like that they're in agreement with, that the U.S. military should be expanded internationally. The AFL-CIO historically, since it was founded, has supported U.S. Intervention, U.S. military bases around the world. And they were supportive of the increase of the military budget to $780 billion. While they don't have money for other things, they do have more money for the military. And yet the labor movement is silent on this. And it seems like that is a major issue in the United States, going in Ukraine and around the world.
You're right. You're right. Now, what we need to be doing is not supporting the expansion of the U.S. military. First of all, we spend more on our military than every country in the world combined. So even if we were to cut our military budget in half, we would by far have the largest, strongest military in the entire world. So this is not a question about domestic security by any stretch. Frankly, the real threats in our country right now are the rise of fascism. That's where the threat is. And the diminishing of our democratic rights as a people. That's where the security threats are, not foreign players from around the world. But the labor movement can't be singing the tune of imperialism and singing the tune of U.S. expansionism. What we need to be doing instead is reaching out our hand in friendship to those places, those people, those movements around the world, which are also fighting for a more equitable, more free, more democratic world. And that's where the labor movement needs to build solidarity.
And the AFL-CIO Solidarity Center is funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. The budget increased to $75 million a year. What is your view about the AFL-CIO taking money, millions, tens of millions of dollars from the U.S. government for international solidarity?
Look, I think that international solidarity is crucial. But instead of that solidarity, meaning that we're getting behind right-wing reactionary forces, be it in the Ukraine or in Colombia or what have you, our solidarity must be to other unions around the world, other working people, indigenous movements, right? From our organization to their movements, and not involving governments and government funding in between. We have the resources in the AFL-CIO nationally to extend that solidarity, do real good work and support work with groups such as be it in Northern Syria, the Palestinians. There has to be the will to do that. So we have to develop a better, more progressive, more left-wing foreign policy as a labor movement. That is absolutely key. But again, we're not going to defeat the evils of capitalism and exploitation in Vermont alone, or even in the United States alone. This is going to take a movement across the world of all working people. And frankly, we have more in common with working people in other countries than we do with the ruling class of other countries, regardless of what international power they're aligned with, or regardless what their views are on the United States government.
And of course, U.S. workers are fighting multinationals the same multinationals that are exploiting workers here and around the world. It seems like freedom of capital expansion is a global issue for workers in every country of the world who are linked up through these multinationals from global capital.
It absolutely is. We had a strike here in Vermont. Machinists local went on strike a few years ago. And the company, Valon Valve or something along those lines, a Quebec company, they were resisting the workers' demand for fair pay wages, and the bosses were demanding that they use more temps, right, non-union temps. But in a great show of international solidarity, workers in Quebec walked out in the middle of the day in solidarity with a strike here in Vermont. And ultimately, our members, our machinist members here, won their strike. But that's a very small example of how international solidarity can matter. But just as capital is international, so must the labor movement be. And we need to be linking up with our counterparts from all around the world and trade unions everywhere in the globe.
And there is a strike right now going on in South Africa, the largest strike in the country, 5,000 Clover dairy workers against another multinational in Israel, the Central Bottling Company, which actually has a franchise for Coca-Cola in Israel. They're calling for support of that strike, that the role of internationalism and solidarity of workers in the United States directly with workers in other countries. How do you see that taking place? Because although there are many strikes and struggles around the world, it doesn't seem like they're reflected in the AFL-CIO on their front burner about international solidarity.
Well, they could be, and we should be. I mean, our Solidarity Center, in theory, should be building that kind of work on the ground in different countries. Now, the problem that we have with that is that perhaps the funding mechanisms may dictate some of the agenda, right? And so this is why we got to rely on ourselves. We have to set our own agendas, and we should have international, and when I say international, I mean truly international, across borders, across continents, annual gatherings of unions throughout the world to talk about how we could support each other, how the fight going on with workers, say in South Korea, we could have impact here by targeting those same internationals that are screwing with them there, and vice versa. These are the type of conversations we need to be happening, and there has to be a massively more coordination going on from union to union, from country to country.
And last, it seems like there are strikes going on that are not getting the kind of support. The miners who've been out for, I think, 9 months now, 10 months, they're threatened Warrior, the Warrior mine controlled by BlackRock. They're fighting for a struggle. It seems like there's not the national kind of campaign by the entire labor movement to make sure that this struggle is successful, and they're being isolated.
Well, Steve, let me say this. There was a time before certain labor laws were passed during the 1930s and after, where essentially everything was illegal of sorts, right? The capitalists had the legal power. Yet working people did what needed to be done by standing together. The laws be damned to get things changed, to change this country for the better. And we need to get back to those roots. If we can't win things like the PRO Act in Congress because 2 or 3 Democrats refuse to do what needs to be done to get rid of the filibuster to actually support it, right? If we can't win in Congress, then those laws shouldn't have to matter to us anymore. We shouldn't be afraid of breaking the laws when the laws are now written and maintained to support the interest of capital, right? We got to get back to our roots of the 1930s, the Great Depression, when we saw real gains. So when we look at these strikes, like the coal miner strike in the South, we should bring back the idea of sympathy strikes. Right? If enough of us stand together, it doesn't matter what the labor law is. If enough of us stand together, they cannot get rid of all of us. We have power when we're united. We have power when we work together. We have power when we're not afraid to use it. And we can't let laws that were written for the bosses get in the way of changing the world.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us. We've been talking with David Van Deusen. He's president of the Vermont AFL-CIO about issues of internationalism and the growth of fascism. So thanks for joining us.
Very.